Topics such as physics can take almost a lifetime to master, and as such can be said to be at the very limit of what a human brain can achieve. Supply chain, on the other hand, education is still very much in its infancy, and much like Plato's Cave of Shadows, there is very much a lot of things out there that we don't know. As such, today on LokadTV, we're delighted to be joined by Muddassir Ahmed, who's going to discuss with us the role of education in supply chains, and in particular what the industry can do to attract the great minds. So Muddassir, thanks very much for joining us again on LokadTV. It's been a while since we sort of caught up, so what have you been up to since you've last been on the show?
Right, thanks Kieran, thanks Jonas, thank you for having me again. Really enjoy your content actually, what are you doing on LokadTV. I think you guys doing a fabulous job in terms of the content and production quality, so congratulations. I'm doing more of the same actually and trying to be better, especially with the SCMDOJO, trying to create more content which is, relevant to the supply chain community, help them improve their, current jobs and help them, solve their problems. So using my 17 years of experience in all the research and I have gathered, right? So more focusing on a content which is more solution oriented, which help them in their, help them in job and improve. So I think most importantly, since last time, what I've done is I've really much focused on the supply chain courses. So if you go to SCMDOJO, you will see a course on SCMDOJO, Introduction to Procurement, courses on sales and operations planning, also introduction to procurement, category management, so on and so forth. And I have managed to develop a lot of supply chain self-assessment tools, which is on materials management, warehouse improvement, also on sales and operations planning. I'm about to launch on the inventory management and supply chain dashboard. So those tools people can just go download and help themselves really. So pretty exciting times, yeah.
Nice. And we'll come back to some of those sort of supply chain courses a little bit later. Joannes, our kind of topic today is all to do with kind of education within supply chain. What's kind of your initial overview?
My initial overview, it's actually tough. There are this boutade, sort of small joke, which is to say, if you know how to do something, you're just doing it. If you know a little bit about it, you're managing it. And if you know nothing absolutely about the subject, then you end up teaching it. And so I started, I think, a few years back to try to teach supply chain on I would say, on a limited manner on the Lokad website, mostly through knowledge-based entries. So that was a series of articles of various length. And more recently, I've tackled a grander project of doing a whole series of supply chain lectures. And what is very difficult is that my perception is that despite 70 years or so of, I would say, of modern supply chain research, we are still at a pre-scientific age in this field. So it has, I think that this whole field of study. Obviously, supply chains are not just a field of study; it's also a practice. But like any practice, you need to have like a body of knowledge that is what you use to basically support your actions. That this body of knowledge is still very much pre-scientific, and that there is a lot of loose ends when you try to have an element that would really constitute the core if you want to go beyond the anecdotal evidence, beyond the small recipe, beyond like the educated common sense advice, If you want to go beyond that, to have something that would be, where you would be deeper, it's quite difficult because there is not necessarily that much and for a whole series of problems.
Okay, Muddassir, would you kind of agree with that, this idea of supply chain being in the pre-kind of scientific age? I mean, it's not one of those topics that you'd kind of learned classically at school. So what do you think to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I just recently, this is a brilliant topic actually. Let me say that, and thank you for opportunity for talking about this. And I can talk almost all day, but I'm gonna give you few key testing points which I've recently done. So I've recently done a survey on how you actually end up in supply chain career. So I'll give people on LinkedIn two choices, right? Do you end up by luck or you actually plan to be? Because when I was growing up, everybody wants to be either, let's go for engineering or do MBA or become a doctor. So people take as an undergrad those choices. And even after that, people say, okay, they end up in the industry and then they decide what to do. So when I was in my 16 years of supply chain career, which is predominantly in Europe and Middle East and small time in USA, I've seen the same ratio that 60 to 70% of the people, they end up by luck. I mean, they were doing something else and they end up in supply chain, and they like it, and they like it as a profession, and then they say, and then they think about, okay, let's go and educate yourself, right? And that's probably the starting point of the problem. The other thing is, even the people who start their career by education, which very much relate to the point where Jonas was making on, it's pretty old, it's still we in the very much codex space. Still talking about people. I have to name the two biggest brand in supply chain education, which is Apex, or previously they were Apex, right? Apex before, now they changed their name. American Society of Supply Chain Management, and then the SIPs in UK. They're still talking about the basic stuff, materials management, logistics, warehousing. If you see their curriculum, and they're selling it for thousands and thousands of dollars. Same with the SIPs. So the supply chain core competency has not really moved on from the requirements of the industry, because the requirements of the industry has changed. So coming back to the poll, what I was saying, that people saying they end up by luck, and then they start learning and they start from the basics, right? So what we as influencers and as the leaders in the business, I think we have a huge responsibility to change that mindset, and that is the key agenda of what I'm trying to drive at SCMDOJO, right? And probably we're going to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, so Muddassir kind of spoke about maybe that idea of people falling into supply chain, kind of ending up there by luck. I mean, it's an industry that's been around ever since people started trading. So why is it that it's an industry that is still kind of in its infancy, and why is kind of that structured education kind of not there?
So, you see, my views on progress is that progress, especially scientific progress, is something that is completely non-linear. It doesn't happen. There is, I mean, in insight, you can always, create a story that explains why, we went from Newtonian physics to discover electromagnetism, and then quantum physics, etc. Relativity first, quantum physics after, etc. And you can always, do some storytelling to basically have a grand explanation of why we went through all those stages. But the reality is very, very messy, and there is not necessarily that much, logic or linearity in the sense of progress. And so the main problem, for example, that I have with supply chain is that it's not that what is being taught right now is ancient. There is plenty of, for example, in math, we are basically teaching children with math that were invented 2,000 years ago, and it's perfectly fine. And same things about physics, kinetics is basically 3 centuries old physics. It's just fine. It's not a perfect. It's not perfectly accurate if you want to have like bodies that moves at close to the speed of light. But as long as you remain at non-relativistic speeds, kinetics, as they were taught more than 2 centuries ago, is still pretty much fine. So the fact that it is old, has nothing to do with the fact that it's true or not, and that it remains true. The thing is, again, due to the fact that I think it is lacking some kind of, core scientific properties, what we have is essentially a big catalog of opinions. And some opinions disguise themselves as, I would say, as science, because there is like numbers and formulas. That would be, what safety stock is about. In my perspective, it's just an opinion. It's certainly not a fact, certainly not something that would be proven or akin to, a law of physics or whatever. It's just an opinion of something that should be good for supply chain. And so you have this ocean of opinions, and thus, indeed, it's very unsatisfying. But again, that's pretty much the case of what you had, in pre-scientific times. If we go back to what was, physics like, in the Middle Age, there was a vast, collection of completely incomprehensible and usually contradictory theories. It's not that there was no theory of physics at the time. There was like tons of them, and they were all, I would say, more each one was kind of nonsensical, and they didn't yield much results, you know. So in the end, it was like again a vast ocean of opinions, and it took certain, I would say, certain discoveries to crystallize, you know, the scientific knowledge, and so that you can have something that is more capitalistic. The question is, do we have this something that will be a similar body of knowledge for supply chain? I'm not quite sure, and that I would say is my biggest criticism when it comes to actually educating, you know, people about supply chain, is that what are we even going to teach?
Okay, so let's turn that question to Muddassir then. I mean, if there are so many kind of theories out there, like Joannes kind of sort of said, and you're teaching kind of your clients about kind of the dark arts of inventory management, I mean, where do you start? What is it that you're actually teaching them?
I'm going to extend the let's call it the philosophical concept. I mean, Jonas just said, I think he gave a very good example of the physics and the theory of physics. The basic is still is valid, and how he moved his argument towards the theory of relativity and the recent knowledge of physics, which is quantum theory, etc. So I'm going to say is this. So the basic knowledge. So let's take a bit of history. So supply chain exists forever, going back when people wants to or the emperor wants to start a new city. What they used to do is to basically send the soldiers to start a new city, because the soldiers was very good in basically laying down tracks and the logistics of starting a new city. So the whole concept existed. So if you talk about in the army, I mean there is a huge amount of concept they're going to train people on the logistics. So this concept logistics and supply chain exist. So the theory actually started when the automotive industry grows in late 50s and 1960s, when they start using the word logistics management, and then it becomes supply chain in early 80s, and this is where the theory started. But then they focused on the core competencies of the supply chain, right? When they talk about materials management, when they talk about sourcing, we talk about procurement or strategic sourcing, warehouse logistics, trade management is there, demand forecasting is there, inventory management is there. So this is the core body of knowledge that has been established from the 1980s to, let's call it, 2000, right? And I think what happened after that, it's the progression hasn't happened, let's call it from Internet 2.0. So let me give you a relevance how the supply chain knowledge as let's call it a body of knowledge and function has in progress. So some of the people who's old enough as me, and I'm sure you folks are young. I mean, I graduated in 2001 when the internet was just there. You start using Yahoo browser or whatever. Then from then what was marketing was, or whatever the financial as a finance as a function was, and look at where they're right now from 2001 until 2021. In 20 years, the whole people are more focused on digital marketing. The only reason me and you guys know each other is basically the advent of Internet 2.0, which is digital marketing, because we connect on LinkedIn and we communicate, we build rapport, we build relationships, right? Because that's why we know each other. Same with fintech. What was the way the financial institute or financial functions within even the business, the way they used to manage their the controlling and the financial transaction has changed, because there's a new tools and software in place. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in supply chain, and the reason that hasn't happened in supply chain because the let's call it the leaders or the subject matter expert, they have forgot that there's a technological development happening, and we have to catch up to that. So that's one spare we are lagging, because now everybody's talking about AI, machine learning, blockchain, IoT, cloud, right? I am hearing this for the last 5 years, but when I talk to people, and most of the supply chain leaders, and I talk to a lot of people, only a very handful of them actually knows how to use the available technology, which is there for last 5 to 10 years, into their business, into what specific application. I see supply chain knowledge right now is in the three. If I draw a Venn diagram in 3 different circles. So the first one is the basic supply chain competencies, which we know exist for last 20-30 years, right? Which is a hygiene factor. That's the base knowledge. For me, that's given. Without that, you just would not be qualified to call yourself a supply chain or procurement professional, right? So you should know everything in terms of the technical competencies, right? The theory and the practical side of that. If you're a fresh graduate, you should know, and then you should be able to apply. The second sphere is the technology part. So you need to understand in terms of what's happening from the technology space. So how Internet of Things, IoT or Industry 4.0 people are talking about it, but what are the key applications, right? Is this more useful in the logistics environment, or is it more useful in the procurement environment? Just to give an example, for me, it's more useful into a logistics environment where you're moving goods around, you're tracking, tracing, visibility, right? Same when we talk about supply chain digitalization. What does that mean? So where you should start? What is your baseline? So understand that sphere, understand technology, and then review your current baseline of where your business is or your knowledge is, and try to close the gap. The third sphere, which I think is very important, right, which 70% of the supply chain people spend time, is the people and the soft skills, and we should be focusing on that hugely. So when we talk about the people skills, soft skills, that means your presentation skills, your communication skills, your problem solving, how you network, international exposure, right? Your emotional intelligence, all is a huge part, because when you're negotiating, when you're presenting, I see a lot of clever people, hugely competent supply chain folks, but they just do not know how to present their ideas. So if you can't present your ideas or your improvement, whatever you want to do, you're not going to get the buying in, and it's gonna die, and it's gonna be demotivating. So in the current supply chain education, the baseline is given, which I think we should spend 20-30% of the time in supply chain competencies, which is the basics. Then we should really focus on the emerging technologies, existing technologies, and its application in the supply chain context. And the third one is how you're going to develop your soft skills to utilize the technology available, and also apply your basic supply chain competency. So this would be my strong advice, and this is where SCMDOJO will be focusing on.
Okay, great. I think we can certainly kind of agree with maybe those kind of soft skills and kind of the core fundamentals. But would you agree with that there's kind of all this amazing technology out there, but nobody knows how to use it?
Disagree in terms of vision. But first, we have to assess, when we have knowledge, how much is completely accidental? Is it like true knowledge about some fundamental elements about the universe, or is it just made up knowledge? And here you see that was the problems during the Middle Ages with scholastic studies, where basically people were producing enormous mass of knowledge, and they were saying, this is it, if you want to be a savant, you have to know all of that. But it was, in retrospect, we see that it was all made up. There was like 50 hierarchies of angels in heaven, and their various properties and political organization and whatever, all of it was entirely made up. And that was considered as, real, and if you knew all of those stuff, you were considered as knowledgeable. Obviously with a more modern perspective, it seems ludicrous. But the question is, it's more general. I'm very, if the other sciences what they have taught us is that those taxonomies in general, they are very weak as bodies of knowledge. It's not because you put a name on something that suddenly you know anything about it. It's not because you put the name of procurement, sourcing, etc. Yes, you've just described stuff in ways it is usually done, but is there really truly fundamental knowledge about that? So I really challenge, what are those basics we are talking about? There are some basic description, but I challenge the fact that there is really powerful knowledge. And again, if I have to put this sort of description of taxonomies compared to the 4 equations that defines electromagnetism, there is a massive amount of knowledge in those 4 equations that can explain literally tons of things, versus things where you can have a gigantic taxonomy that almost explains nothing.
So have you got an example of where that happens, maybe in a supply chain context?
I mean, for example, the fact that people would say, oh, we have purchasers, planners, forecasters, people that are in charge of procurement, or that there is sourcing, or that there is a purchasing division, or that you have S&op. You have lots of terms that have, I would say, where you have nearly, you have more content in the taxonomy itself that you have knowledge about the real world that is supposed, where this taxonomy is supposed to be attached to. And when you investigate, you will see that most of those things, they are very made up. There is nothing fundamental about them. So that's why I say, for me, my perspective is that first we are on this pre-scientific time in supply chain, is that what people are calling the basics are, for me, extensive catalogs of stuff, taxonomies that are pretty much made up, and there is no much science, there is no much knowledge behind that. It's a long list of arbitrary definition, and just there is no fundamental, justification on why it's even, a good topic. Just to give you an idea, in one of his books, Feynman has produced, a whole series of books about physics. And when he basically introduced, for example, the notion of force in physics, he spent almost like an entire chapter to basically think of all the possible alternatives to introducing the concept of force. He said, we had 20 different ways to go about that. And in the end, we decided to have a very specific way to modelize a force and the mathematical representation attached to that, and discuss in great length why. Because out of all the alternatives, it's actually the great way to think of the problem and to reason about it, and it's very powerful, even as an algebraic system. And so the question is here, what I see again, when I say pre-scientific, I don't say that there is no knowledge whatsoever. I just say it's very confused, it's very made up, it's very accidental. A lot of that sometimes emerge of completely, compliance of completely legal reason, which is not a justification at all. And so that would be my first concern. And then when people think about technologies, because they have not even really specified what sort of games are being played, are being solved, it's super confusing. What are the auxiliary sciences? And here again, if we go back to supply chain, the situation is completely muddied. For example, when it comes to numerical models, you will find very confused descriptions on where does the statistic stop, where does the supply chain start, where does algorithmics end, and where does supply chain modeling start, etc. And so again, that reflect for me that all of that is kind of reflecting a field that as a whole is really lacking maturity, and it's still, there is a long journey ahead of us to just put structure to the field so that there is something worthy of being taught.
Okay.
And that's one of, I would say, super tough challenge.
Muddassir, would you agree with that then? Would you say that some of these kind of course concepts are very much kind of muddled and there's no kind of clear clarity in some of those sort of very basic kind of subjects?
Joannes said a lot of things, right? I try to follow, remember most of them, but let me repeat a few things he said, and I'll tell you what I agree or disagree. I think I agree that before that he talks about the philosophy of the physics, which is fine. But then now Joannes what he's trying to say is the taxonomy of physics or chemistry, which you can define in as a formula, right? Or the laws of gravity or things like that. Then that kind of let's call it structured approach, it does not apply to supply chain knowledge. And whoever come up with
Does it? You say it does not apply.
Joannes, can I finish my argument? I'll come back to that. Right. Mm-hmm. So and then I think Joannes was going about saying that the supply chain competency which is being defined, your capacity planning, demand planning, master production scheduling, warehouse management, the technical competency which I talked about is all made up. And it has no basically scientific background to it. So let me tell you these two things. First of all, for someone who worked in industry for 16 years in supply chain as a practitioner and learn then the research in supply chain, which I'll come back to that, is actually very offensive, right? And I took offense for that. And I 120% disagree on what you just said. Because most of the supply chain knowledge has been established, right? And it's been researched based on the proper research on the operations management, right? So let's take an example of the research I did. So I did a research on a supply development framework, right? So when you do a research in this, so I have developed an enhanced supply development framework. So when you talk about supply development, which is a very tiny piece of the whole sphere of the supplier relationship management, right? So supply relationship management is a very tiny portion of the procurement management in general, right? So you start from procurement, then you talk to supply relationship management, and within that, you talk about supply development, right? And within that, we have 500 pages of literature, we have 150 articles, research articles published on a grade A journal talking about what are the best practices available to either develop a supplier strategically or reactively. You're yourself a company, essentially a supplier of a software to the companies who wants to do inventory optimization or modeling or forecasting, right? You cannot develop, you cannot provide good customer service without understanding your customers and what they do, right? So your customer feedback actually helps you to develop your product, right? That itself is supply development, and that is the theory of supply development. So I actually 120% disagree. This is based on some made up stuff, totally wrong, offensive in fact.
Okay, so let me get this point. When I say, you see, when I say it's made up, I'm not saying that there is not a grain of truth or it's completely wrong. This is not my point. My point is, if you look at modern science, is that you should take risk with regard to what you're stating. So you see, the problem is that, for example, if I come up with a classification and I tell you there are, I would say, cooperative supply chains and innovative supply chains, a taxonomy, you know, I classify companies between those two extremes or whatever, or I can have a few more categories. My fundamental problem with this approach is that you cannot disprove this approach. You see, this is descriptive, and this is the same sort of problems that was plaguing zoology during, I would say, until basically mid-19th century. You see, it's just descriptive, and it's the way you basically, you know, slice and dice what you can observe is very made up. It's not that it's absolutely wrong in the sense that it's nonsensical. It is, but in the end, if you want to have something that would absolutely prove that the distinction that you've made, the way you've sliced and diced your observations, has some kind of absolutely fundamentally correct properties to it. You see, the difference is, look at, again, if I go back to chemistry, 17th century, you have a lot of substances. People say if it smells different, if it looks different, it is different. The modern approach is that, no, we are going to look down to the atomic composition and we are going to see whether it's different or not, and we have an absolute criterion to say whether it's alike or not. And then we can literally prove that this criterion is literally the best we can get. It's literally, there is no more, you know, there is no refined way to classify things. It's literally not an accidental classification. If you look at the periodic table, the periodic table is not an accidental classification of the elements of the universe. It is some essential, fundamental truth about matter in the universe. You cannot divide matter, you know, organize matter in any other way. So this is a taxonomy that has some, no, it has some absolute fundamental truth to it. And it is irreducible. It is not something that you cannot, you know, add elements to the table. You cannot remove elements to the table. And you can't have another alternative table. It's literally, you can merely change the layout if you want. This is it. So this is a taxonomy that has some fundamental property attached to it. If I take things like to basically the way companies decide that they have a marketing department, a procurement department, a sourcing department, and a purchasing department, I would say, I'm not saying that it's idiotic. I'm just saying that don't get fooled into the fact that it's largely accidental and that there is largely nothing whatsoever that would be that this specific organization has any fundamental truth to it. It's a custom. Like any custom, you know, it's important to know what is being practiced as a custom, but don't confuse, you know, a custom with a grain of scientific truth. And just, you know, again, it's a matter of what you know and how much you can get from it. If I take the best of the best, which are, you know, things like the 4 equations of electromagnetism, in just 4 lines, you have like an entire field of human affairs and human industries that derivate from those 4 equations. It's it's stunning in a way. If I look at supply chain, I will find, you know, entire books filled of stuff, taxonomies, and I can barely do anything out of that. You see what I mean? I'm not saying that I can't do anything. I'm just saying that you see that it's absolutely not the same power of knowledge, you know, the same density of knowledge. That's my point. Can you do you see a bit where the point I'm getting at?
See, I'm I'm reflecting. I'm reflecting and thinking at the same time, and I'm trying to I am trying to get to to point of view. And I'm thinking, okay, can I be 100% agree? And the answer is no. Let me tell you. I think the philosophic this is it's still a question of this. I think this is the question. It's the way you're defining supply chain knowledge, right? You're trying to fit into a science, which is therefore you have given quite a lot of examples on the periodic table and physics law and all this, right? But what I'm saying is, and I'm 100% sure what I'm saying is, supply chain management is a body of management, right? It goes, therefore, supply chain is not taught, is actually in the engineering in the same department as chemistry or physics. Supply chain is actually taught in the management school, right? So most of the university you go in, so supply chain is a body of knowledge, is under management umbrella, right? And the management itself, as you know, being a leader yourself, that okay, the leadership, there's a lot of research on leadership or qualities of genuine leadership. You have to lead by example. You have to be a strategic thinker. You have to think beyond the movement. You have to concern of people. I can carry on. I can give a lot of examples of leadership behavior, but you could argue, or there is no periodic table for leadership. I mean, you cannot create a periodic table for leadership. Therefore, you cannot create a periodic table for the supply chain competencies, because it's an evolving body of knowledge under the management, which is 80%, 70% is all about. I'm telling you, working in the industry, 80%, 70% is all about the soft skills, management skills, and the management part, and there's only 20 to 30% is the mathematical model in that.
That's where I think I profoundly disagree. And that's something of interest, because you see, if you look at chemistry, chemistry has been, since basically for the last 2,000 years, it was a practice. And people say it's all about management. It's a practice. You have to have the right, gesture, the right know-how on how to produce compounds. And something spectacular happened during the 19th century. People realized that you can have a scientific methods to it. And yes, there had been corporations for centuries that where it was essential basically to have the right leadership, to have the right management, to have the way, because it was basically, it was an art. And so literally it was all about managing large teams of people that were, crafting that as an art. And it was people were thinking it was a pure matter of really bringing right people, right skills so that you can do that. And then during the 19th century, the chemical revolution emerged, and they realized that it could be a science. And suddenly we went from chemistry being something that was like, completely unscalable, that was not very capable, to something that was incredibly civilization changing, thing, where literally there is not a single thing in our daily lives that has not been deeply revolutionized by chemistry. We have plastics all over the place, even, it's so my point is, again, if you look at most the fields historically, when they were in their pre-scientific age, people were saying at the time, it's all a matter of leadership. It's a matter of management. And then the only way where you can literally multiply the effectiveness, the power of action by a factor, let's say 1,000,000, was through the scientific methods, where suddenly you transform. And literally, if I take, same sort of argument, I'm choosing, different topics, is that if we go back 150 years about transports, people would say, oh, it's about, you need to care for your horses. You need to train them, and you need skills to train horses, and you need to be gentle with the beast, and you need to do this and that and that. And then there are some people who invent the automotives, and they just, eliminate the whole things. And so my point is, I'm not saying that there is that those soft skills are not important. I believe that they are important in any single field of human affairs. Those soft skills are always important. What I'm saying is that if we want to have an improvement of the order of magnitude of, factor 10, factor 100, factor 1,000, it's not through soft skills that we achieve that. It's not through soft skills that we manage to basically bring the distance between Europe and the United States to go from a month through a boat to just 8 hours through an aircraft. It was through the precise application of scientific knowledge that we have been able to build basically super fast aircraft that were also very reliable, and very safe. It was so you see my point, and the question is that when I look at what, for example, Amazon is doing with supply chains, and they are, for example, applying scientific knowledge to basically rethink entirely how they should organize warehouses. You could think, oh, through better leadership, you can have a better run warehouse where you have like 25% more productivity because you have a warehouse leader that is very, very good and that exhibit excellent leadership qualities. Can you have a leader that gives you, that multiply the productivity in your warehouse by 1,000 times? The answer is no, hell no. It's not about leadership. You need something that is fundamentally different. And that's the essence of something that is very evasive about those scientific methods, is how can you have something that is 1,000,000 times better? And if there is, an act of belief, even an act of hubris, something that is crazy ambitious, is that the scientific method says that basically you have the ambition to have something that is incredibly better, where the human mind can engineer something where you're not into doing something that is going to be like a minor improvement in the qualities of the people. People have been people for 2,000 years. Yes, you can educate, you can bring them to be a tiny bit better, but if you want to have something that is capitalistic, where you stand on the shoulder of giants and you capitalize on that, and you have generations of minds that add up all their collective knowledge to have something that is incredibly powerful, you need something that is very much like science. Okay. That's my proposition for supply chain.
Gentlemen, I think we're going to have to kind of agree
leave him the last word. I don't want to have the last word.
So, yeah, Muddassir, if you wanted kind of a last point, and also if you could maybe just sort of finish off by sort of telling us kind of what your hopes are with the SCMDOJO over the next sort of coming months, and what your hopes are with regarding kind of education.
No, I'm still trying to understand where Joannes is coming from. I think where we could agree is the three parts. So I think the Amazon example is a good example where they have used technology to provide better customer service, and the information, communication, visibility. So that's definitely where the scientific mindset and the science and technology would definitely create huge amount of value. I think, but the Amazon success is more down to the way they design their network and to the logistics network, which is more, I think, competitive advantage than anything else. So we agree on that part, that the technology and there is that can revolutionize the supply chain. There is no debate on that. I think we agree on that part. But fundamentally disregarding the soft skill people side and the basic supply chain competency, that it doesn't matter, it's made up stuff. Certainly disagree with that part. That's my conclusion.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think there's one thing we can kind of agree on, is a bit of healthy debate always kind of pushes things forwards. So thank you both for kind of your time. And yeah, if you agree, disagree, let us know in kind of the comments below. So thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thanks for watching.